They say war changes a man, but Vietnam didn't just change them. It shattered them, bent their minds until reality and nightmare became one. If you're listening to this, prepare yourself. Because we're about to walk through a war where the enemy wasn't always visible, and sometimes it lived inside you. Imagine you're 19 years old. You're pulled out of your high school graduation, given a uniform, a rifle, and shipped halfway across the world to a place you've never heard of. It's humid, hot, and the air smells like wet soil, sweat, and diesel. That was Vietnam. And for hundreds of thousands of young American soldiers, it became a living hallucination. Why did so many come back broken? Why did they wake up screaming? Decades after the war had ended, why did some never truly return at all? Let's begin where most of their stories start. Arrival. The jungle was alive. That's what every soldier noticed first. It wasn't just trees and plants. It hissed. It whispered. It screamed with insects, birds, and shadows. You didn't walk into Vietnam. You were swallowed by it. Soldiers would describe the first night like this: hearing footsteps they couldn't trace, sounds without source, and a constant sense that something or someone was watching them. And yet, nothing would happen. Not at first. The Viet Cong were ghosts. They didn't fight like Americans were trained to. There were no clear front lines, no uniforms, just farmers by day and killers by night. You'd march for hours, sweating through your boots, past bamboo and banyan trees, and suddenly, a shot, a scream, then silence again. The randomness made it worse. It wasn't just battles, it was ambushes. You never knew when or where death would strike. One step, you're alive. Next step, a landmine takes your legs. Or worse, a friend is talking beside you 1 second, and gone the next. For many, the psychological damage started long before the gunfire. Sleep deprivation was constant. You couldn't risk sleeping too deeply. You couldn't take off your boots. Some soldiers would go weeks without a full night's rest. Imagine that, your mind already strained by fear, now hallucinating from exhaustion and the jungle. It didn't help the noises at night twisted into voices, the wind into whispers. It was like the war wanted to crawl inside your skull. Some soldiers would say, the war wasn't just around MIT, was in me. And the fear wasn't the kind you imagine in movies. It wasn't a scream or a dramatic last stand. It was quiet. It was crawling. It was the fear of not knowing, of waiting, of watching. It made your heartbeat feel like an enemy. And then came the firefights. You'd hear a click, maybe a rustle. Then gunfire would erupt. Chaos. Pure chaos. Shouting, explosions, smoke. The jungle would light up in flashes. And through it all, you'd fire in directions you weren't even sure of. Sometimes at shadows, sometimes at nothing, other times civilians. And that was the hardest part. The enemy didn't wear a uniform. They didn't follow rules. A child might be carrying a grenade. A woman might smile, and then pull out a weapon. Every interaction became a gamble with death, and slowly paranoia set in. Soldiers began to see threats in every face. Kindness became suspicious. Villagers who offered water or food might be scouts for the Viet Cong. Some weren't, many were. But eventually, it didn't matter. Trust was a luxury. And in Vietnam, luxuries got you killed. That paranoia grew like a sickness. It turned some men cold, others cruel. There's a story, a real one, of a squad that walked into a village after one of their own was killed by a sniper. They didn't find the sniper. Instead, they found rice bowls, hammocks, a few old men, some children, and in a moment of rage and fear, they opened fire. It wasn't combat, it was vengeance. But they couldn't tell the difference anymore. That's what war does. It erodes the boundaries. One soldier, years later, said, "In Vietnam, I stopped knowing who I was. I stopped feeling anything. It wasn't just about killing. It was about feeling nothing after. Back at base camps, there were moments of calm, but calm brought reflection, and reflection brought guilt. Letters from home arrived, filled with love and pride. Photos of high school girlfriends, mom's recipes, baseball scores. But none of that felt real anymore. The world they left behind felt like fiction, and the world they were in felt like hell. To escape, many turned to substances. Marijuana was common, opium, even heroin. For some, it dulled the noise in their heads. For others, it was the only way they could sleep. You might judge that, but ask yourself, if your days were spent walking into death, and your nights replayed the screams of children, what would you do? There were others, though, those who resisted the numbness. They held on, wrote journals, sang songs, prayed, laughed. In dark humor, brotherhood became their shield. That bond between soldiers, the ones who watched each other's backs, who dragged each other from fire, who shared silence when there were no words, that bond became the only thing keeping many sane. But even that was fragile. Because one day, one of them would die, and you'd carry his body, or what was left of it, and bury him. Sometimes with a prayer, sometimes with a joke. Because if you cried, you might never stop. And so you moved on. Numb, tired, haunted, older than your years. But here's the question that still haunts many of them. If I survived, why do I feel like I died there too? Some returned to America to cheers, others to protests. Some were called heroes, others baby killers. but inside, they were still in the jungle, in their dreams, in sudden noises, in crowded streets that reminded them of ambushes. They came back with medals on their chest and shadows in their eyes. Vietnam didn't just happen in Southeast Asia. For them, it was inside every breath they took afterward. And here's the chilling truth. Some veterans said they missed it. Why? Because in war, they had purpose, simplicity, a clear goal. And when they returned, they were lost, forgotten, unemployed, alone. Some were homeless, some took their own lives. Others just drifted. The psychological impact wasn't a chapter in their story. It was the story, and we're just beginning to tell it in the next block. We'll dive deeper into the hallucinations, the PTSD before it had a name, the friendly fire, the My Lai massacre, and how war can strip a soul bare without ever touching the skin. But for now, remember this. You can remove a soldier from the war, but not the war from the soldier. If you found this story powerful, subscribe and stay with us. Because what comes next is even darker. They called it friendly fire, but there was nothing friendly about it. In Vietnam, the jungle didn't just blur your vision, it blurred your judgment. When the heat, the noise, and the fear all collided, the line between enemy and ally vanished. And in that blur, men made choices they would regret for the rest of their lives. There was one incident. It still echoes. A platoon deep in the Central Highlands, surrounded by thick jungle walls. Radio contact lost. Fog was dense that morning, like soup in the air. They spotted movement, green fatigues, helmets, a column emerging between the trees. They opened fire, every man on instinct. They didn't wait, they didn't check. The column, it was another American unit. 12 dead. The youngest was 18. That kind of mistake doesn't fade. You don't forget the sound of your own rifle killing someone who was supposed to go home just like you. But this wasn't rare. In Vietnam, it happened more than anyone likes to admit. The jungle deceived your eyes, the heat melted your thoughts, and your brain, overwhelmed, began to betray you. Soldiers would speak later of hallucinations, not always drug-induced, just raw mental collapse. They'd see movement where there was none. Hear their mother's voice in the hum of insects. Feel like their body wasn't theirs anymore. There's a story of one man who saw a fellow soldier walking without a head. Turned out the man was fine alive. It was his own mind creating visions of death before it even arrived. But some didn't wait for visions, some walked straight into death. One soldier wrote in his diary, "Today, a friend stood up during a firefight and walked into the open. Just stood there, arms wide, didn't duck, didn't shoot. When he fell, we didn't even scream, we just kept firing. And no one talked about it after that, because talking meant feeling, and in war feeling could break you, so they buried it deep. Along with everything else, they buried the screams of children from villages, burned in search of the Viet Cong. They buried the sounds of choppers leaving without them. They buried the smells charred flesh, rotting jungle, the iron scent of blood. But buried things have a way of crawling back, especially when the body is in America. But the mind is still in Vietnam. Some nights, even now, veterans wake up with soaked sheets, screaming, kicking, eyes wide open, but seeing something that isn't there. A helicopter spinning out of control, a friend's body torn apart, a river filled with fire. PTSD, we call it now. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Back then, it had no name. It was just battle fatigue or bad nerves. You were told to drink, to forget, to man up. No one gave you therapy. No one said, "You're not crazy, you're hurting." Instead, they gave you silence. Or worse, judgment. Because while you were trying to forget the war, America was trying to forget you. But the jungle didn't forget. Even the terrain had a way of punishing you. Leeches on your skin, mosquitoes carrying malaria, trench foot from constantly wet boots. One wrong step and you'd fall into a spike pit lined with feces to ensure infection. They called them punji traps. And what did that do to your head? It taught you that everything could kill you. Every vine might be a wire. Every child might be bait. Every scream could be a setup. You'd watch a wounded enemy cry for help, and then detonate a grenade. When someone got close, so you stopped helping, you stopped trusting, you stopped seeing people as people. And when that happened, when your humanity began to rot too, started to change. Slowly, quietly, until you weren't sure what kind of man was staring back at you in the reflection of your helmet. Some embraced the darkness, gave in completely. Stories emerged units that didn't follow rules. Soldiers who took trophies, ears, fingers, who laughed at death like it was a game, who lost themselves so deeply there was no coming back. But not everyone. Some fought to stay human. They wrote poetry in the dirt with sticks. They carried pictures of their children and whispered to them at night. They played cards, cracked jokes, sang songs about home. They tried, desperately, to remember who they were before the war. But then something would happen, an explosion. A scream, a lost friend, and the walls they built to protect their minds would shatter again. One soldier wrote, "I built a version of myself out here. He doesn't flinch, he doesn't cry. He kills and sleeps. But sometimes, the old me wakes up, and that's when it hurts the most." That internal war, the one between the man you were and the man the war demanded you to be, that was the real battlefield. And many lost it. Suicides among Vietnam veterans remain shockingly high, not just in the months after the war, but decades later, because trauma doesn't age. It waits. Sometimes, it waits until a quiet night in a peaceful suburb, when a firework cracks the sky, or when a child drops a toy that sounds too much like a grenade, or when a man sees jungle vines in his garden and freezes thinking he's back in Laos. And yes, some healed, but even those who found peace never forgot. One veteran said, "You don't leave Vietnam, you just learn to walk beside the ghost of it." There's something else. We often forget the enemy, the Viet Cong. The North Vietnamese soldiers, they were also human. Many were young, many were terrified, and many carried their own demons back to their villages, their families, their graves. War doesn't care what side you're on. Trauma is democratic. So imagine a world where two soldiers, one American, one Vietnamese, sit across from each other. No weapons, just stories. One says, "I watched my friend bleed out in a rice paddy." The other says, "So did I." And in that moment, maybe they both realized they were both victims of something far larger than themselves. But that's not the story most people want to hear. They want heroes and villains. Clear lines. Good versus evil. Vietnam didn't give us that. It gave us broken lines, gray zones, moral compromise, and a generation of men who left pieces of themselves in a jungle halfway around the world. And yet, they kept going, because they had no choice. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering could kill you. So they marched, they loaded their rifles, they followed orders. Even when those orders didn't make sense. And some asked, is it bravery if you're just trying to survive? The answer is yes, because survival in a war like Vietnam wasn't just about dodging bullets. It was about protecting your mind from itself, and for those who made it back, who built lives, families, futures. They carry scars no X-ray can show. They don't talk much, but they remember everything. The faces, the smells, the way the jungle moved, and the silence that followed every scream in the next block. We'll step even deeper into My Lai, into moments where morality collapsed, into how guilt took root like a parasite. We'll confront the things most documentaries won't dare say, because understanding Vietnam isn't about maps and strategies, it's about what it did to the human soul. If this story resonates, don't forget to subscribe, because the truths we'll face next are even more difficult. There is a moment in every soldier's story where the line between right and wrong disappears, where orders blur into instinct, and survival bleeds into savagery. In Vietnam, for some, that moment came quietly. For others, it exploded in a village called My Lai, March 16, 1968. It was supposed to be a routine operation. Charlie Company of the 11th Brigade was sent to a small hamlet in Quang Ngai Province. The intelligence said it was a Viet Cong stronghold, booby traps, fighters, resistance. What they found instead were women, children, and old men. And what happened next would stain the soul of the American military forever. The soldiers moved in, the villagers gathered. Some smiled nervously, others bowed. They were unarmed, no shots fired, no visible threats. But something had shifted inside the men of Charlie Company. Days before, several of their friends had been killed by mines, by snipers, by traps they couldn't see. They were angry, tired, afraid, and they were told this village was the enemy. So, they opened fire, not at soldiers, at civilians. They dragged people from homes, shot them in fields, pushed them into ditches, and mowed them down with machine guns. Babies, mothers, grandfathers, livestock. It didn't matter. They killed over 500 people that morning. The images of that day, tiny bodies, blood-stained grass, a soldier covering his face in shame would haunt the world when they surfaced. But in that moment, most didn't feel anything. They were numb, frozen inside a nightmare they had stopped trying to wake up from. How does this happen? How does an 18-year-old from Indiana, who once went to church, helped his mom with groceries, laughed at baseball games, how does he become someone who can pull a trigger on a child? The answer isn't simple, and that's what makes it terrifying. Vietnam was not just a war of bullets. It was a war of dehumanization. From the first day of training, many soldiers were taught to see the Vietnamese not as people but as gooks, Charlies, shadows in the trees. It made killing easier, it made mistakes acceptable, and it made horror routine. One soldier later said, "You either turned off your soul or it got ripped out." But not everyone followed the crowd. There was a helicopter pilot, Officer Hugh Thompson, flying above My Lai that day. He saw the massacre unfolding beneath him, women running, children falling. He couldn't believe it. He landed his chopper between the soldiers and the remaining villagers, pointed his guns at his own troops, ordered them to stop. He saved lives, dozens. But when he reported what he saw, he was ignored. Later, when the truth leaked, he was vilified by some, a traitor, a coward, for trying to stop a massacre. Think about that in a war so twisted, the man who tried to save lives was the one treated like the enemy. And yet, he did what others didn't. He remembered who he was. But for most of the soldiers who witnessed My Lai or worse, participated in it, the weight never lifted. Years later, many came forward. Some confessed to what they did. Others couldn't even speak the words. Their eyes said everything. There's one man, a gunner, who testified decades later. He described lining up villagers in a ditch, watching the dust settle on their hair, hearing them cry, and then pulling the trigger. I didn't see people, he said. I saw the war. But it was the war that stayed with him. Night after night, he heard their screams. He tried to drown them with alcohol, with silence, with pills. Nothing worked. He once told an interviewer, "The war ended for America in 1975. It never ended for me." This isn't an isolated story. Malay wasn't the only village. It wasn't the only atrocity. It was just the one that was caught. Others happened in the dark, in places without cameras, without survivors. And the soldiers who carried those memories, some never told a soul, not their wives, not their children, not even themselves. But trauma isn't polite. It doesn't wait for an invitation. It creeps in, slowly, through dreams, through triggers, through the quiet guilt that builds like poison. Some broke down. One veteran, a decorated sergeant, drove his car into a tree after writing a note that simply said, "I can't see their faces anymore, but I still feel their blood." Another disappeared into the woods of Oregon, lived off the grid, said the forest was the only place that didn't judge him, and others turned violent. Domestic abuse, bar fights, arrests, because when you teach someone to suppress every emotion, then give them a lifetime of horror to suppress, they eventually erupt. Still, many tried to rebuild. They went to therapy. They joined support groups. They sat in circles with other veterans, holding coffee cups and telling truths that felt like knives. They cried together. They forgave themselves. They forgave each other. But they never forgot. And some said they shouldn't. Remembering, one vet said, is the only justice we can give to those we hurt. He wasn't just talking about the Vietnamese civilians. He was talking about the boys who became monsters, and then men again. Because here's the truth. No one likes to admit, war makes monsters, and then abandons them. It trains them to kill. It rewards them for it, then sends them home with medals, and no manual for how to live with what they've done. Imagine being 20 years old, with the smell of burning skin still in your nostrils, trying to sit in a college lecture about world politics, or work at a supermarket, or hold your child without remembering the baby you couldn't save. The transition wasn't just hard, it was impossible for some. That's why we need to talk about these things, not to excuse them, but to understand them, because ignoring them only guarantees one thing: they'll happen again, in the jungles of a different country, with a different flag, but the same wounds, the same silence, the same ghosts. Because war doesn't just kill, it changes the living. And in Vietnam, that change ran so deep, it rewrote identities. One soldier said, "I left my name in that jungle. The man who came home, I don't know who he is." In the next block, we'll shift the lens again, looking at what happened after the return. The VA hospitals that failed them, the families that couldn't understand them, the long dark corridors of mental illness they were forced to walk alone because the battle didn't end with the last bullet. It started all over again on American soil. If this truth matters to you, if these voices deserve to be heard, stay with us, because the most devastating chapters are still to come. The flight back from Vietnam was silent. For many soldiers, stepping onto that plane felt like stepping out of hell. But as the wheels lifted off the tarmac, and the jungle disappeared beneath the clouds, they didn't feel relief. They felt nothing. Some stared at their boots the entire way. Others tried to sleep but couldn't. A few clutched letters from home, now damp with sweat and mud, rereading the words like they belonged to a different world. They were going home, but no one told them the war was coming with them. The welcome was not what they expected. There were no parades, no hugs from strangers, no grateful handshakes. In fact, some didn't get a welcome at all. When they landed, they were told to change out of their uniforms before stepping into the airport. The brass said it was for their own safety. Why? Because protesters were waiting, because signs were raised calling them baby killers, because returning from war didn't make you a hero, it made you a target. One soldier said, "I got spit on within 15 minutes of stepping off the plane. I had more respect in the jungle." Another was called a murderer by a woman who hadn't even looked him in the eyes. America didn't just want the war to end, it wanted to forget it happened. And for that, the returning soldiers became scapegoats. Imagine that. You survive ambushes, malaria, sleepless nights, dead friends. Moral collapse, then you come home and people treat you like you're the problem. So many stopped talking. They didn't tell their families what happened. They didn't explain the nightmares, the panic attacks, the sudden outbursts. They just bottled it up. They drank. They isolated themselves. They lied about their service, and in the silence, the war grew louder. Some tried to go back to school, but sitting in a lecture hall at age 23, surrounded by fresh-faced students talking about politics and theory, didn't feel right. Some tried to build families, but they'd wake up in cold sweat, grabbing their wives' wrists in the dark, screaming for cover. Some tried to find work, but the moment a boss raised his voice, they felt the adrenaline rush, the twitch, the instinct to strike or run. When they sought help, they found doors closed. The Veterans Administration was overwhelmed, underfunded, ill-equipped. Therapists didn't understand combat trauma. PTSD wasn't even a recognized diagnosis yet. Doctors prescribed tranquilizers, sleeping pills, and silence. One vet said, "I told them I was hearing jungle sounds in my head. They told me to turn the TV off. And so they turned away from help. Some ended up on the streets, others in jail. Some never found their way back into society at all. You could walk past them on a sidewalk, at a gas station and never know. But they were carrying entire wars inside their heads." There's a story of a man named Mike. He served 2 tours, survived ambushes, booby traps, even carried a friend's body for miles. But what broke him wasn't in the jungle, it was at home. He got married, had a son, got a job fixing cars, but he couldn't sleep. Loud noises made him duck. He kept a knife under his pillow, and one night when his baby cried too loud, he broke down, locked himself in the garage, slept in the car. He didn't leave the house again for 2 weeks. Eventually, he left his family, said they deserved someone who wasn't haunted. That was the word many of them used. Haunted, by faces, by choices, by everything they saw and everything they did. But some fought back, not with rifles but with words. They wrote books, gave interviews, formed support groups. They told the truth, even when it hurt, even when people didn't want to hear it. That's how America finally learned about My Lai, about PTSD, about what war really does, not just to bodies, but to minds. It wasn't easy. Some of these men were accused of weakness, of betrayal, but they kept speaking. And slowly people listened. Documentaries aired. Therapists began to study trauma. The term PTSD was born in the 1980s, too late for many. But not for all. Still, the damage was done. An entire generation of warriors had returned home and been abandoned. They never got the care they deserved, the understanding, the space to heal. So, they made their own space. In basements, in church halls, in dusty VFW buildings, where coffee brewed and chairs creaked. They sat in circles, swapped stories, cried, laughed. They created their own therapy because they couldn't afford to stay silent anymore. Silence had cost too much already. One vet said, "I lost 2 friends to bullets in Vietnam. I lost 5 to suicide after." Think about that. More soldiers died after coming home than in the war itself, not from bullets, from pain, invisible pain. And yet, they endured, because that's what they were trained to do, because in their minds, breaking down was a failure, and that belief planted in training camps and battlefields was the last thing to die. But not all stories end in darkness. Some found light. They became mentors, helped younger veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. They spoke in schools, told students about the real cost of war. They carried their scars like medals, not of honor, but of survival. They showed the world that healing is possible, that you can walk through hell and still find purpose. That trauma doesn't have to be the final chapter, but to get there, they had to confront the war inside themselves. They had to accept that the jungle wasn't just in Vietnam. It had grown roots in their minds. And to cut those roots, they had to speak. They had to tell the stories no one wanted to hear. Like the man who said, "I saw a child die, and I did nothing." That moment has lived longer than she did. Or the one who said, "I wake up every night and check the perimeter of my house. There's nothing there, but in my mind, I'm still on patrol." These are not stories of weakness. They are stories of survival, of endurance, of humanity shattered and slowly rebuilt. In the final block, we'll close this journey. We'll look at how the legacy of Vietnam changed how we see soldiers, how it changed war itself, and what we still get wrong about trauma today, because the war may have ended, but its lessons, they're still being written. Subscribe, stay with us, because the end of this story is just as important as its beginning. Time passed. The guns fell silent. The uniforms were folded away. Medals were tucked into drawers, and photographs yellowed with age. Vietnam slipped out of the headlines, faded from the newsreels, and gave way to new wars, new enemies, new fears. But inside the minds of those who fought, the war never ended. And here's the haunting truth. It didn't just stay in them. It passed on like smoke clinging to fabric, like ash settling in the lungs. The war didn't stop with the veterans. It reached into their homes, into their children, their grandchildren. Its echoes lived in lullabies, never sung, in hugs that felt just a little too tense, in birthdays missed, in love that always seemed to carry a shadow. This is how war echoes. A child grows up flinching at slammed doors, wondering why dad doesn't sleep, why he drinks until the room goes quiet, why he cries at old songs, why he stares at nothing, lost in a memory she can't see. The house is peaceful, but the silence is loaded. Like a minefield, you learn to tiptoe around. A teenage boy finds a photo album hidden in a drawer, black and white snapshots of jungle and guns. A group of young men, smiling but hollow-eyed. He asks his father what it was like. The man pauses, eyes distant, then finally says, "We did what we had to do." And the silence that follows speaks louder than any war movie. In some families, the trauma became a chain wrapped tight around generations. Fathers taught sons how to suppress pain. Be a man, don't cry, don't talk. Daughters watched. Mothers tiptoe around broken men, tending to wounds no one could name. Love became an act of survival. Affection, rationed like wartime supplies, and in other homes, the opposite happened. Veterans broke the silence. They told their stories not for pity, but for healing. They took their grandchildren to the Vietnam Memorial, pointed at names, said, "He was my friend. I never got to say goodbye." And in that moment, the child saw the man not as a warrior, but as a human, scarred, fragile, and deeply real. These moments matter. They shape how history is passed on, not just in textbooks, but in blood and memory. And history, make no mistake, is still alive. Today, Vietnam is a word we say in classrooms. We draw it on maps. We debate strategies, analyze policies, discuss protests. But what about the fear, the guilt, the private hell of a 19-year-old with a rifle, standing at the edge of a village, deciding whether to shoot or be shot? Those aren't just military decisions, they're soul-level choices, and they leave marks. That's why some veterans chose to return to Vietnam, not as soldiers, but as men seeking peace, closure, understanding, in quiet ceremonies far from cameras. American vets have stood beside former Viet Cong fighters, hands once meant to kill, now extended in forgiveness. They exchanged apologies. Some wept together. One said, "We were just boys, both of us, fighting someone else's war." And something remarkable happened. The land that had once swallowed them in terror became a place of redemption. They visited the sites where they had nearly died and lived again. They planted trees, built schools, sponsored medical aid. They rewrote their final chapters in the place where everything had fallen apart. But healing isn't linear. For every story of reconciliation, there are dozens of continued struggle. There are men who never came home in spirit, only in body. Veterans still living on the edge of society, homeless, addicted, forgotten, stuck in the flashbacks, trapped in a war that the world has moved past, but they haven't. They watch younger soldiers come home from Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. They hear the same words. It's different now, but it isn't, not entirely. The guns may be newer, the enemies renamed, but the nightmares are eerily familiar. And it begs the question, what have we learned? If Vietnam taught us anything, it's that a soldier is more than a weapon. He is a man, a mind, a soul, a son, a brother, a friend. And when we fail to protect those things during the war, and especially after we lose more than battles, we lose parts of ourselves, parts we may never get back. But there is hope. Therapies have advanced. EMDR group sessions, art therapy, trauma-informed care. These weren't widely available in the 70s. Now, they are lifelines. Some vets, who couldn't speak about My Lai or Kisan for decades, now write poetry, paint, mentor younger soldiers. They've transformed pain into purpose. There are also nonprofits built by veterans, for veterans. Safe spaces to talk, to cry, to remember without shame, to scream if necessary, to say, "I'm not okay," and be met with, "You don't have to be, but you're not alone." One vet shared, "It took me 40 years to say I was hurting. The moment I did, I started healing. And slowly, society has started to listen." The memorials have grown too. Beyond black granite, virtual walls list names. Online archives hold testimonies. TikToks and Instagram reels share old footage and forgotten truths. Young people leave handwritten notes at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, thanking soldiers they never met. Messages like, "Because of you, I understand sacrifice. This history is mine now too." And perhaps, that's the legacy of Vietnam. Not just war stories, not just dates and operations, but a deeper, harder-earned wisdom. A generation that learned the most powerful weapon is empathy. That strength isn't found in silence, but in truth. That real courage is not just in battle, but in what comes after. There is one story that captures this best. A veteran named James, 3 tours in Vietnam, Bronze Star, lost his best friend in Hue, came home emotionally shattered, couldn't sleep, couldn't hold down a job, couldn't stay married. For years he drifted, angry, disconnected, but one day, his granddaughter asked him for help on a school project. "Tell me what it was like," she said. He froze, then told her everything. The horror, the mistakes, the guilt, the shame. He sobbed. She hugged him and whispered, "I'm proud of you." And it broke him. But it also healed something, because sometimes, all a soldier needs is to be seen. Not as a monster, not as a hero, but as a man who walked through hell and came back trying. That's what this story is really about. Not just the war in Vietnam, but the war after the war. The daily battles, the quiet ones, the ones that aren't commemorated with parades or medals. The fight to feel, to forgive, to remember, to move forward, to build a new identity in the ruins of the old. So what do we do now? We listen, we ask questions, we open space for stories that were never told in school books. We teach the next generation that service doesn't end when the war does. That a handshake and a thank you aren't enough. Not if we keep sending people into combat without caring for their return. We change how we welcome them back. We offer more than speeches and monuments. We offer understanding, real support, mental health care that works, systems that don't fail them. We build bridges between those who fought and those who never had to, because one day, we'll send soldiers into danger again. That's the tragic truth of our world, but we can choose what kind of home they return to. One where they are seen, where they are heard, where they are helped, where they are healed, where their pain is not a secret but a shared responsibility. Because if we carry their stories, maybe they won't have to carry the weight alone anymore, and maybe then, just maybe, the ghosts of Vietnam will finally be able to rest. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it. Let someone else hear what was never taught in school. Because these voices, these truths, they deserve to echo until they become more than memories. Until they become understanding.